Hi, my name is Nick Smith and welcome to Dough Try This at Home. This is a little experiment of mine to help share my passion for baking and cooking, and hopefully it will get you into the kitchen and willing to experiment a little bit and give some things a try. Today I wanted to start with biscuits, the typical southern light, tender, buttery biscuit, which is great for breakfast or for dinner or any time. And the New York Times recently said that this was a gateway project for bakers. So hopefully you'll be willing to tackle this and give it a try. I've been to the grocery store a few times over the past several weeks, and I've noticed that the flour aisle is pretty much empty every time I've gone. So several of you out there might have grabbed a bag of flour thinking that you'll do something with it, but you're not quite sure what you've got. Flour can be a little intimidating because there are a lot of different kinds, and each is suited for its own purpose generally. So I just wanted to go through the different kinds of flours that you would typically encounter at the grocery store, and one or two of these products might be something that you have. And most likely you're going to have something that is going to work for the biscuits that we're going to make today. So the first flour I want to talk about, this is just all-purpose flour, just leaving all the brands aside, but all-purpose flour is kind of your middle of the road go-to flour. It's and it's suitable for most projects. And then, typically, if we didn't have the supply issues that we have, I would say go to a nice soft wheat flour like White Lilly for your southern biscuits. So this is self-rising flour. And a lot of different brands have self-rising flour. And all self-rising flour is that it has flour plus some leavening and salt in it. So it's got your baking soda in it, it has some salt in it. If you want to make biscuits, you're not going to need to do anything else. You're just going to be able to use this, and you're not going to need to add baking soda or salt or anything else to make your biscuits in terms of dry ingredients. And White Lilly, I said leaving brand aside, but White Lilly also has an all-purpose, and they have a bread as well. But just in case, if you have a Pillsbury self-rising or King Arthur self-rising, generally that is what self-rising is. Now, one day I was at the store, and the only thing left were some sad boxes of cake flour. And this is, kind of an odd bird on the flour aisle because it's in a box, it's not in a bag. It's labeled as cake flour, which makes it sound incredibly narrow and specific for its use. But really it is a soft wheat flour, and that just means it has a little bit lower protein content, so it's going to be great for cakes, biscuits, tender, quick breads, things like that. Like your banana bread, you could totally use this if you're making some banana bread. So today I am going to be using cake flour just to show you that it's, there's nothing to be intimidated by it. It's the flour like any others. You're not going to be able to push it, and if you wanted to make, baguette or something like that, it's not going to be a great choice. But for a lot of what folks are doing, chocolate chip cookies, things like that, it's going to be fine. And then I wanted to talk about some other flours that you may have. Now, you may have a bag of bread flour. Bread flour is milled specifically for bread. So what's the difference? I talked about protein content, mentioned that a little bit ago. So protein content is what dictates the development of gluten. And gluten is something that if you're making a bread, like a sandwich bread or a baguette or something like that, you want that gluten to develop. It gives dough structure, it gives it some chewiness, it lets bread rise. When you're making biscuits, cakes, and tender things, you don't want that to happen. So if this is the only bag of flour you have in your pantry, you can give it a try with a biscuit, but it's not going to be that light, tender product that we're looking for today. And then you also have whole wheat flour, and whole wheat flour is its own little item. It's you can totally bake with it, you can do things with it, but it is a different beast. It takes some different skills to work with it. You can't just, if you have a recipe that calls for a cup of white flour, like all-purpose flour, you can't just go out and substitute in a cup of whole wheat flour. That's not going to work. So I just mention it in case some of you grabbed it in a panic and that's what you have. But it's a unique product, and it's not going to behave the exact same way as these other processed flours. So, as I said, today we're going to make biscuits. So I've got all the ingredients ready to go. So like I said, I'm going to be using cake flour. So I'm starting with a cup of cake flour. I'm also going to be, since this is not self-rising, I'm going to need to put my leavening agent in. So I've got my baking powder ready to go. And just to give you so I didn't grab this out, but this is baking powder. This is what you want. And this is baking soda. This is not what you want. So, and at the end, I'll talk about some substitutions in case you may not have one of those products. But anyway, so I have 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder to go in my 1 cup of flour, and I have 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So those are my dry ingredients. Now I also have, because biscuits are basically flour and leavening plus a fat plus some liquid. And my preferred fat is butter. So I have 4 tablespoons of butter that I have cut into chunks. And then milk. So I'm just using regular whole milk. You can use skim, 1%, 2%. You can use buttermilk if you want. It will add a nice little tang to the biscuit, but it's not necessary. So I'm just using regular whole milk. So those are the ingredients. And then I've got what I need to make the biscuits set out as well. So I've got my mixing bowl, so I'm just going to be doing this by hand and with a fork. You can get, if you have a pastry blender and you want to use it, these are pastry blenders. It helps you cut in your fat or your butter. Feel free, but I am going to be cutting in my butter by hand, and I'll show you that technique. And then I've got a baking pan for the biscuits to go on. I've got a little whisk. I'm going to mix the flour and all the dry ingredients together with this. You don't have to, you can just use a fork. And then before the biscuits go in the oven, I've got a little pastry brush because I'm going to brush them with some melted butter so that they brown nicely and get a nice crunchy top. So the first thing to do before we get started is let's preheat our oven to 400 degrees. So let's go ahead and, oh, it was already on. So let's go ahead and do that. And then let's get started, and I'll show you how to mix all of this up and get some biscuits in the oven. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, you can form the biscuits a variety of ways. Some people will pat them out and cut them with some kind of cookie cutter, biscuit cutter. Today I'm just going to be real simple about this, so I'm going to cut them into squares. I've just got a knife ready to go to do that. Some people will form them into little balls, with their hands and not bother cutting them out. The plus of cutting out a biscuit is that you do give it a better chance of rising, so you get those kind of layers and a little bit more rise out of it. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got my mixing bowl ready to go. So we will add in the 1 cup of flour, which I'm using cake flour. 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and again that's baking powder, not baking soda. 1/4 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of pastry. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking soda. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of salt. 1 teaspoon of baking powder. 1 teaspoon of squish. 1 teas And then just give that a little whisk to blend it. Okay. And now to that, we're going to have 4 tablespoons of butter that have been cut up into chunks. I'm going to dump that in. Okay. And now, so you could use a pastry blender here. What I do is I'm going to flatten these chunks of butter, just squish them with my fingers, and just keep doing that. Squish the butter with your fingers just until they're all kind of pieces of flat butter and there's no more real chunks. So just go through and you know, so, and you want some big chunks of butter in this. You don't, or not big chunks, but you want big pieces of butter. You don't want this to be like a pie crust or anything. You want some texture here. So if you see, you know, I've got these large pieces like that, that's perfect. I don't have any huge chunks, but everything is, you know, it's been well mixed enough for purposes of making biscuits. So try to get some of that flour off my fingers. And then I'm gonna add in my milk. Now, for this, you're gonna use about 1/4 cup to 1/3 of a cup of milk. So pour some of that in there and mix it with a fork just till it comes together. All right, so there we go. Now, some of you may be thinking, wow, that is so wet and loose and I put way too much milk in there and it is a total disaster. Not a problem, because, you know, for the most part, biscuits can be pretty forgiving. There's a few areas where you can run into problems, but, you know, if your ratios aren't exactly right as you're putting them together, it's really not the end of the world. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get ready to pat them out and cut them. So I'm going to generously sprinkle flour here on the countertop. Okay, and then I'm gonna get this dough out, and it is really sticky on here. Sprinkle some flour on top. Put a little flour in the bowl, kind of rub it around to get this out. Okay. Put that out. All right. So, and basically my theory is that this is really going to take up enough flour with this method, and it's going to all be fine. So it's a very sticky dough, but this surface is nicely floured. Now, at this point, you do knead these a little bit, but kneading develops gluten, so you don't want to knead them a lot because you want that tender biscuit. So what I do is I just fold it over, kind of like a letter. Okay, pat it back out, fold it over. Okay, redistribute the flour there, turn this over, pat it back out. Let's give it maybe 1 or 2 more folds. So see how it's starting to come together, but it's still a very tender dough. So let's do maybe 1 more and we'll be done. And the reason I'm folding it is I'm trying to create more layers. Folding is a technique used in puff pastry, and it creates layers of butter. So I'm trying to help you know, create layers of butter by folding instead of just kind of kneading a traditional way and then giving it, patting it out. Okay, so there we go. So there we have a nice, you know, it's still a very tender dough, it's very delicate, but it's together enough for our purposes. So I'm gonna just grab my knife. As I said, I was just gonna cut these instead of using a biscuit cutter. So one thing is I want to take off the edges so that I've got clean cuts on all sides of my biscuit. So just gonna give this a little flour here to help it not stick. And then just gonna cut the top, fall, cut the sides. A little more flour on my knife. There we go. All right, and then I'm just gonna divide this probably into 4 pieces. So this recipe makes about 4 to 5 biscuits. So give it 1 cut there. A little more flour. Give it 1 cut here. There you go. All right, now this extra dough, it's gonna take, if I wanted to, I could cut another biscuit out of it, but I'm just gonna roll it and pat it out. And there you have a more traditional shaped biscuit. So now I've got my pan. So we'll put these biscuits in the pan. And I do space my biscuits pretty close together. So because I think it helps them rise, it kind of gives them some support as they bake. And then put this guy in the middle there. So make some room to set this down. So here we are, all right? And my biscuit is about, that initial dough is about 1 inch thick. But I want these biscuits to brown. So what I'm going to do is I have a little melted butter ready to go. So I'm gonna brush the tops with that. So here we go. Here's a little melted butter. And this will make them nice and crunchy on top and brown beautifully. Now some people will put butter in the pan and dip the biscuits in melted butter so that both the top and the bottom are coated in melted butter. It's makes for a very crunchy top and bottom and a very decadent biscuit. It's all right, so that's good. So set that down and now into the oven. So as we're waiting on the biscuits to cook, I just wanted to go over a few things. Clean up. You may say, wow, that is an awful lot of flour you've wasted kneading the biscuits. But what you can do is just scrape that off, put it in a bowl, and the next time you have to knead something, you can reach for this flour instead of the flour that's in your bag. So also, you know, the extra butter that you've got from brushing the tops, throw it in the fridge. Next time you make some scrambled eggs, put it on there, or you know, anything like that, throw it on your toast. Did want to talk about keeping flour, because if you've never had flour in your house before, and that's 10 minutes, so let's check that and I'll come back to the keeping of the flour. Okay, they look great, but I think the tops are not quite as brown as I'd like them to be, so I'm just going to give it 1 more minute. But back to storing your flour. If you've never had flour in your house before, they do attract some weevils and moths and things like that you may not realize are there and appear and get into your flour, and especially now where it's not as readily available as it normally is, it would be a real shame for that to happen and for that for your flour to go to waste. So I recommend getting some kind of plastic container to store your flour in to keep anything away from it. It can be like this. This is from the Container Store. It's made for a 5-pound bag of flour to go in it. You can dump your flour out and put it in here. You can just put the flour in its bag. You can do glass jars, you can do other things, but I really want to encourage you to store it in something other than just the bag it came in. Okay. And now that extra minute has passed, so let's see what we've got. Okay. We've got some beautiful biscuits that are nice and golden brown on top. I'd probably let these go a little bit longer to get them a little bit more brown on top. So let's stick them in. So that was on 400 degrees and it has been 11 minutes. So let's see, let's set the timer. Because you definitely don't want to put them back in and forget. So it's always a good idea to set a timer anytime you throw something back in the oven for a minute or two extra. So that was the biscuit recipe, made 5 biscuits. Now you may say, well, that's great, but I need to make more than 5 biscuits. I've got a family of 4, and there's no way 5 biscuits is going to be enough. That's totally fine. Just double the recipe. So it'd be 2 cups of flour, it'd be a tablespoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of salt, and then a stick of butter, and about a half a cup, maybe a little bit more, of milk. And just proceed as we did, and just don't be afraid. That's the most important thing. So that 1 minute passed really quickly. Let's see what we've got. There we go. I think I'm gonna call that. So you've got a biscuit, a nice beautiful biscuit, a nice crunchy brown top, and it's very tender, and you can kind of see how tender it is, well, they're hot, but how that just breaks apart, and perfect for your jam or whatever else you would like to put on it. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll give biscuits a try, and as well as a lot of other things. So I hope to see you again.